All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning and happy Halloween, everyone. Hope you had a good weekend. I enjoyed seeing the OU football game on Saturday. Travis and Drew, nice job. Close game. You guys pulled it out in the end. I've never seen a game like that before. It was pretty crazy. Marge, it was awesome to see cheer too. It was cool. It's the first time I've been to a football game in some time, so it was cool to see everyone performing. And yeah, it was quite the game. It's cool. So happy Halloween. I found this slide. So this is a obviously fictional anatomy of a zombie brain slide, but it's weirdly anatomically accurate. And I couldn't help but share it in terms of the parts of the brain it references here, including some of which we're going to talk about in our next unit on the brain. So I was impressed with it. Was clearly someone who knows their anatomy and zombies made this this poster. Just a quick reminder that Dr. Vadney is teaching the neuroanatomy class in the spring. I know registration for some of you is probably this morning, right? For some early this morning. So just another plug for her class. It sounds like it's going to be really great, especially if you're interested in the topics that we've been talking about right now. So today's agenda, we're going to start off with quiz number 4 in class today. I've got that ready for you. We're going to take a quick stretch break. And then we're going to get into the brain and see how far we get talking about the brainstem today. And then just some reminders and a ticket out at the end of class. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take quiz 4. You've got 20 minutes for it here in class. Before I hand these out and we get started, what questions do you have as you were reviewing material for today's quiz? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording for this and resume recording. Give me a quick survey from the class. Just a thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs sideways. How do you feel like you did on the quiz? Got some downs, some ups, sideways. Okay, perfect timing, Jessica. We just finished up. Cool. Take a quick second here and give yourself a stretch break if you need it after the quiz. Just take a minute, collect your thoughts. We're going to transition back to the brain. I'm going to do a stretch break. All right. So let's go ahead and get started with this guy, the brain. So this is a general diagram. This is a great place to start of the major structures of the brain that we are going to walk through. So this is a lateral view of a human brain. So this is anterior, posterior. So somebody looking this direction. A couple major structures here, some of which you're probably familiar with, but I'm going to walk through them to make sure. The bulk of the brain in terms of size and mass is the cerebrum. This is the big thing. This is generally what you probably think of if someone says brain. But it's really important to note that that's just one part of the brain. It's a big part, and it's obviously a very important part, but it's only one part. We also have the cerebellum, which is this kind of grapefruit shape and size piece back here in the inferior and posterior region. And then we have some structures kind of down the middle of the brain here. First, we have the diencephalon, which you see in purple here. There's some structures associated with this. This is where your thalamus is, hypothalamus, epithalamus. We'll talk about that. And then we have this section here, which is called the brain stem. And the brain stem has 3 major components: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, moving from rostral to caudal. So I'm going to note here that when I talk about the brain, I often use the terms rostral and caudal instead of inferior and superior. And rostral refers to the nose, so the parts of the brain that are closest to the nose, here somewhere. Caudal refers to the tail, which is the part of the brain that's closest to where your tail would be, here somewhere. The reason we do this is because the brain that you see here, human brains have this kind of vertical structure because we're bipedal. But most of our closest relatives and other mammals generally have the same parts, but oriented more horizontally because they are quadrupedal. So for example, in lab, we'll see some sheep brains. And I want to just keep these structures, the way we describe them, consistent across the different brain types. So for both brains, saying something is rostral versus caudal works pretty well. So just note that terminology. I'm going to start off talking about the brainstem first, then we're going to work our way to the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and then the cerebrum. But first, I want to just draw your connection back to what we talked about last week in terms of white and gray matter. So this slide has a lot on it, and I'm going to walk you through it. The diagrams here are 3 transverse sections of your central nervous system. One from the, this is, which part of the brainstem is the pons or the, oh, this gets the cerebellum. Okay, this is actually the region of the cerebellum. This is part of your brainstem, and this is the spinal cord. You can see here moving from rostral to caudal. What I want you to take away here is the orientation of white and gray matter. Notice that in your spinal cord, as you saw last week, we have this kind of butter shape of gray matter in the middle, surrounded by white matter. As we get up into the brainstem, we can see this gray matter surrounding the central canal. So the central canal is smaller in the spinal cord relative to the brainstem. The central canal contains cerebrospinal fluid. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's this canal that contains fluid that circulates within and around your central nervous system. Notice here in your brainstem, we also have these other specks of gray matter. We're going to talk about some of those in detail. Those are referred to as brain nuclei. Remember that the terminology is a little confusing. I know there's a nucleus in a cell. These are centers of cell bodies in the central nervous system referred to as nuclei. And they're great because they contain lots of cell bodies or short unmyelinated neurons. And so they don't have the white color of the white matter, which again is white because of the myelin sheaths surrounding those axons. Then we get up into the cerebrum or cerebellum, and you'll see this in the cerebrum as well. We have this gray matter on the inside, these nuclei, but now you can see way up on the top there, there's some gray matter on the outside. And that forms what's called the cortex of the cerebrum and the cerebellum. We have this gray matter on the outside. So you often hear in common parlance people talking about your cerebral cortex, and they'll say like your visual cortex, your motor cortex, your sensory cortex. Those are all those are all parts of this gray matter on the superficial aspect of your cerebrum. This is something I just learned that might help you, is the word cortex comes from the word for bark, as in of a tree. And I, for the longest time, have a hard time remembering that cortex means something that's in the outside. I think because the word cortex has the word core in it, and I think of the core as being in the middle. And for some reason, my brain keeps wanting to think of a cortex as being inside. But if you remember that cortex comes from the word for the bark of a tree, then you can remember that it's the outermost layer. So again, you see in the cerebrum and in the cerebellum, this outer cortex of gray matter. As we move through the structures of the brain, we'll talk about the gray and white matter in each of these structures individually. But I just wanted to give you the overall gist of where you can find that white and gray matter and why it's important. So let's go back to the brain. I'm going to provide this slide for you. The brain, I'm not going to get into too much of the development of the brain, but I do want to lay out some general terms here. And you can see 2 columns here. On the left, we see the developmental regions of the brain. So these are the regions of the embryonic brain. And then we can see the subsequent adult structures that are derived from that. So the telencephalon becomes the cerebrum in an adult brain. The diencephalon becomes 3 parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Note that we still refer to these 3 structures together as the diencephalon in the adult brain. Then we have the mesencephalon becomes the midbrain, which is part of your brain stem. The metencephalon becomes the pons and the cerebellum. And then this myelencephalon becomes the medulla oblongata. So different structures of the brain are derived from different embryonic structures. Now, what gets a little bit confusing, this is pretty straightforward here. We have this kind of direct relationship between the embryonic structure and the adult structure, right? Not a big deal. Where this potentially gets a little confusing is when we talk about what we refer to as the brainstem, which refers to the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, the midbrain, pons, medulla, but not the cerebrum. So weirdly, the adult brainstem contains structures that are derived from the mesencephalon and the metencephalon and the myelencephalon, but not all the structures derived from the metencephalon. So the cerebellum is derived from that same structure as the pons, but they separate in the adult brain, and then we consider these three things our brainstem. I'm going to come back to this slide over and over again throughout lecture as we talk about each section of the brain. So it's a bit much information now, I know. Go ahead and mark it down and just know that we're going to revisit this and kind of come back to this as we walk through the brain so you can make those connections. Having said that, we're going to start talking about the brainstem. So I'm going to start with the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and I'm going to work from caudal to rostral. So we're actually going to start talking about the brain with the medulla oblongata. Let me give you a second. I see lots of writing to get that down, and we'll move into that. All right, so the brainstem, if we blow it up from the diagram here, you can see in a little more detail here. Note that I have the diencephalon up here in purple. This is not part of the brainstem. The brainstem is what you see in kind of greenish blue, and that is moving from caudal to rostral, the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. I'm going to talk about each of those structures in turn with a little more detail. As we do that, you get to draw a diagram and add parts to it as we go. So please go ahead and start by getting some paper or digital screen, I don't know, whatever. Draw a big diagram of the brainstem from the lateral view, basically what you see right here, and label the midbrains, pons, and medulla. I want to emphasize you should draw this big because we're going to add a whole bunch of things to it as we talk about each of these structures in turn. So for now, I want you to make just a big general one. As we work through lecture, you're going to add different components. So basically draw this. If you want to include the diencephalon on top, that's great. If you really like the diencephalon, if you don't, that's fine too. We'll talk about that probably, what's today, Monday, probably Wednesday or Friday, we'll get to the diencephalon. I'm just kind of doing a survey to see your diagrams are coming. Once I see most of you have that, we'll move on. It's looking good. Let's take another 30 seconds or so. All right, so before we get into the anatomy of the brainstem, there's four general structures general functions I want you to know about the brainstem. So important things the brainstem does. The first is it is the passageway for all of the fiber tracts. Remember, fiber tracts are what we refer to as these bunches of generally myelinated axons of neurons traveling between the cerebrum and the spinal cord. So your cerebrum, we'll talk about this in detail, but remember that's the big part of your brain. And that's where kind of the higher order thinking happens. That's where your cognitive awareness, your executive function, all that kind of stuff happens. And so all the neurons that allow the cerebrum to communicate with the spinal cord pass through the brainstem. So super important. And that's that white matter of the brainstem. Those are those fiber tracts of neurons connecting the brain to the spinal cord, and from there, the rest of the body. The brainstem is also involved with the innervation of the face and head. So you have 12 cranial nerves, 12 pairs of cranial nerves, better said. I will talk about these in more detail. We'll talk about it in lab a bit. But for now, I want you to know that 10 of the 12, so the vast majority of them, emanate from the brainstem. There's two, cranial nerves 1 and 2, connect directly with the cerebrum, and that's your olfactory and optic nerves, and you'll see those in lab. So 10 of the 12 cranial nerves have their they basically emerge from the brain in the brain stem. The brain stem is not really involved in this higher order thinking, but rather produces some automatic behaviors necessary for survival. So does anyone want to take a guess what an automatic behavior necessary for survival might be? Something you don't think about, but if you didn't do it, you'd be in deep trouble. Breathing, good. What else? Digestion. Oh, good. Well, the vagus nerve does emanate from there. So there's some digestion. So it does regulate some of that. That's actually, I hadn't thought about that, Brenna. That's good. What else? Breathing, heartbeat. Yep. Also involved with regulating blood pressure, things like that. So these functions that you're not consciously thinking about, but your body is regulating, your brain is regulating, I should say. And then finally, the brain stem integrates auditory and sensory reflexes. So I talked the other day about a reflex where if you hear a loud sound, you turn your head towards it without really consciously thinking about doing that. That is a reflex that's processed through your brain stem. So some of these auditory and sensory reflexes. So those are the four big functions of the brainstem. We take a look at a brain from an inferior view. So from the bottom looking up at a brain, you can see the spinal cord here running into the medulla oblongata. You can see the pons, and you can see the midbrain. Although in this view, it's kind of covered up by these lobes of the cerebrum. So this is what a brainstem looks like. Our lab, going to be in 2 weeks. We're going to do the brain lab. So a little bit asynchronous there, but you'll see some examples of this. I have a really nice human brain that's been sliced. So you can see all these structures, and we're also going to take out sheep brains and dissect those as well. So you'll see all these structures in the actual brain. And I want to just point this out because you can see here that all this stuff is pretty much the same color. I'm going to show you some nice color-coded diagrams. Just want to be clear that those are just color-coded for clarity. That doesn't actually look like those different colors. But having said that, you can see very clearly all of these cranial nerves emanating from the brainstem. You can see very clearly the medulla oblongata. You can see a transition into the spinal cord. The structures are very clear, they're just not colorful. So let's take a look at the external landmarks of the medulla. So this is a ventral view. So this is the same view that I'm showing you right here. But now we just have a diagram form, again, with the pretty colors. You can see the diencephalon up here. Some important external landmarks. So we're going to talk about the medulla here first. What's cool is that what's interesting is the medulla is continuous with the spinal cord. So there's not like a clear line where the spinal cord ends and the medulla begins. Rather, the spinal cord, especially when it passes through that big hole in your occipital bone of your skull, transitions and becomes the medulla oblongata. And you can see here two structures called pyramids that are kind of pyramidal shaped in cross section there. And these guys contain the tracts that of white they're white matter that contain the tracks that primarily are involved in neurons in voluntary motor control from your cerebrum to your spinal cord. So those nerves are passing through here. Those I shouldn't say nerves, those the axons of those neurons are passing through those pyramids of the medulla, and that is signals from the motor cortex of your cerebrum to the rest of your body, allowing voluntary motor control. So you're moving your hands right now to write. That information is passing through the pyramids of your medulla oblongata. Now, what's really interesting, I think, is that there is a section here called the decussation of the pyramids, and you can see some little fibers here. But this is where those nerve tracks actually cross over. And this is why your right hemisphere of your brain generally controls the motor output on the left side of your body and vice versa. So this is why, for example, if someone has a stroke on the right hemisphere of their brain, then they often suffer from paralysis on the left side of their body, because those signals, I think something like 90% of those signals, those voluntary motor signals, cross at this part right here, this decussation of the pyramids. So that's why the hemispheres of the brain control the opposite sides of the body. So with that in mind, get your notes and go ahead and add the pyramids and the decussation to your diagram of your medulla. Now, I know that your medulla is from the other orientation, probably, where your whole brainstem is from the other orientation. Just do the best you can to draw and label those parts. All right, I want to show you a couple more structures and then we'll wrap up. So again, going back to the brainstem from a lateral view, there are a couple other parts of the medulla that you should know. One is what's called the inferior cerebellar peduncles, which are fiber tracks that connect the brainstem and the cerebellum, which is kind of over here. And then we have this section, I don't really understand why it's called this, but it's called the olive. And the olive of the medulla contains something called the inferior olivary nucleus. So this is one of those centers of gray matter that's responsible for relaying sensory information to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is important for a lot of kind of subconscious control of the body. And so especially information about where your body and your parts of your body are in space is relayed through this inferior olivary nuclei. You can go ahead and add those two structures to your diagram as well. So the inferior cerebellar peduncles are down here. That's kind of the most rostral aspect of your medulla. And then you've got this section right here, which isn't really a structure so much as just kind of a section of the medulla and the rostral end. I think I'm just going to go ahead and stop there. I've got some more stuff for you on the medulla for sure, but what questions do you have so far? All right, I'm going to skip ahead to wrap up a couple announcements here, and then we've got a ticket out for you. So just a couple of reminders about our upcoming schedule. We have lab tomorrow. It's going to be on the skull. Your lab guide is now available in Visible Body, and on your class program for Wednesday, I have to read over the lab guide before tomorrow. I think getting in the habit of looking that guide over in advance of lab will be really handy. We're not doing any cat dissections tomorrow. We're actually going to do a lot of drawing of bones of the skull. So go ahead and look that over. It's available now. Also a reminder that lecture exam number 3, no, this should be number 2. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. All the information there is correct except for number 2. is going to be open this Sunday and Monday next week. Remember, a week from today, Monday, we will not have regularly scheduled class. The exam will be in Blackboard, the same format as the last exam. I don't have this on a slide yet, but I'll just announce it now and I'll give you the information coming up. But next week's lab, so a week from tomorrow, November 8th, November 8th happens to be election day also. I'm going to make our lab that week an asynchronous virtual lab to give everyone some flexibility in your schedules. Part of my reasoning is to make it as easy as possible for you to go vote. I will give you information about that, but we will not meet for regular scheduled lab a week from tomorrow. Tomorrow we will, I want to make that clear. Be there tomorrow for the skull, but the following week, we're going to do an asynchronous sensory lab, which should be pretty cool and just give everyone a little flexibility in their schedules that day. Reminder that Danny has tutoring sessions, including today from 4 to 5 in the lab room. Probably not going to be reviewing too much lab material today since we just had our practical, but he'll be there. And I'll have open hours today. I've got to leave a little bit early, but I'll be there till 1:30 if you have any questions to stop by. Otherwise, I tick it out with a couple of questions. I've got 2 questions on here. See how well you can answer those without looking at your notes. Just give me a little bit of feedback about how your understanding goes. And you can upload an image of your drawing. Kylie, go ahead. That last one. Yeah, let me get everyone the QR code and then I'll go back to that. No problem. And I see phones down. I'll go back. Okay. Where are we here? This one?
Yeah.
Cool. Mm-hmm.